Welcome to this breakout session, Module 4, here in Rima, and welcome also to our online audience. I am here to present Tim Jones. He is a community arts innovator, and he has worked in several different projects. He has, for example, been a producer for Coney Theatre that we heard about yesterday. He's a consultant and works in culture and urban development. And today he will be sharing with us case studies of several projects which raise questions about community and what that means in the arts and culture sector. And we will have some time for Q&A, I imagine. So, yeah, short time for Q&A. welcome, Tim.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for that. Thank you for inviting me. Good news and bad news. The good news is that having experienced the discussion upstairs this afternoon, I now have a much stronger sense of where I fit in the programme and the conversation, because I've really wrestled with what might be the most relevant content to share with you guys, because I do a lot of different things in a lot of different sectors. But that was helpful. Bad news is we're running over. So this session is going to be shorter than previously envisaged. I have a problem that I can sometimes talk incredibly fast. So slow me down, and let's maybe do less stuff well, rather than try and throw the kitchen sink at things. Okay, I called this, when I needed to give text for the programme, I called this session Bursting the Bubble, connecting with people making culture on their own terms. And really, it's because I've been working using arts and culture for my career and in my work for 25 years. I still believe fundamentally that the creativity and culture in every one of us can be a powerful lever for positive social change if harnessed effectively. I also think that as I think has been insinuated yesterday and today very strongly, that there are significant infrastructural limitations across a lot of the arts and cultural sector, a lot of which is to do with institutional mindsets and a sense of preserving content and fear of aligning how you develop and share content with the public in ways that are more aligned with an evolving, much more digitally native audience. And I think these things are significant impediments. In terms of my own work, it means that I now dip in and out of the arts and cultural sector and dip in and out of different economies. And I make that a bit harder on myself because the emphasis that I put on my work is around community development and community engagement, which, so I'm from the UK. You talk about this stuff in the UK. Well, actually, you don't talk about this stuff in the UK very much anymore. A lot of it has been cut. A lot of organisations that do grassroots work with communities have struggled. A lot of them have closed. And the kind of whole language around community arts is pretty much dead in the UK. So it's quite interesting to have a career when what you were so fired up about in your 20s and which seemed to have a kind of practice and a sort of set of established players is now, in many respects, either extinct or had to radically transform itself, or is perhaps in some degree in denial about the need to transform itself and is kind of clinging on. So I'm going to talk about what I understand. I'm going to talk about 3 projects today from the point of view of innovation in community arts as I understand it and as I practice it in my work as a producer and as a cultural strategist. I'm not a researcher, so I don't have time or particular inclination to draw up papers or talking over complex language about this stuff. I just kind of get on and deliver it, but every time I deliver something, I try and kind of work out how to do it better and how it can provide examples or frameworks for how we can all do stuff better, because I think we should all be doing that. So it's partly about innovation in community arts as a kind of practice, as a terrain, but it's also about this idea of innovation in community contexts of all stripes using the arts. And I guess there's this interesting thing. I've spoken at quite a lot of digital conferences. I started using digital and started weaving it into my work in about 2004 onwards. I felt something big was coming to do with the social voice when I started coming across digital art and started finding ways to patch it into what I was doing. And as a result, I speak at quite a lot of digital conferences every now and then. And it's interesting now to me that this idea of community, when you go to a digital conference that doesn't have an arts and culture specific focus, but it's just about digital stuff, is either entirely about digital communities and what we do about them, or it doesn't talk about them at all, because it's implicit within the digital space. You know, the idea that the socialization of content, making content radically shareable, understanding that your audience has an audience, understanding that from a commercial point of view, that's where a lot of the mileage is in terms of how you exploit the connection economy, is taken as read. And in the culture sector, what we've done historically, certainly in the lifetime of my career, is we put community in this kind of funny box that hangs off the side of institutions or organisation, or sits in a beleaguered department, or we box up communities in the way that we preconceive them before we do anything. So we kind of identify particular participant groups, this terrifying phrase of target groups, where we decide according to an index of social deprivation or a race and ethnicity or something to do with a learning ability or something, there is a marginalised group that would benefit from the introduction of community arts or participatory arts techniques. And I think there's a very complacent and centralised mindset around that still persists, and we would all do well to challenge. So this is my most kind of culturally localised slide. Three challenges that I set myself, and I'd like you to consider whether they're relevant challenges for you in relation to 3 projects I've done. Before I embark on them, just to say that they might not look kind of shiny and digital, some of the projects or some of the aspects of the project, but the work that I do with collaborators is very much takes an assumption that, you know, so we've talked about the phrase post-digital world that we're all living in. I was chatting to a very good friend of mine who does research at the Royal College of Art in London in terms of taking people's digital behaviours and making physical objects out of them. And he said, really, we should be proceeding on the basis of understanding that everything is essentially digital now in terms of media and content. So if you're looking at a broadsheet newspaper, even though it's a physical object, it's part of a digital framework, a part of a digital infrastructure. You look at television, you look at all that other stuff. If anybody wants something slightly more happy clappy, I need to change atmosphere fast, or just keep going. Anyway, here we go. So challenge 1, which we've heard about yesterday and a bit today, community-led creativity. The audience has an audience. People can make stuff without needing the endorsement or the tools from cultural organisations to get on and do it. We are all curators. We all curate the layout of our iPhone screens. Annette from Coney, who's here, made a point about how people are creating and discovering and utilising their own ways that suit them, their own kind of creative practice. How can we think about working in ways that are more open, that are more social, that are more lightweight, and that are more effective, given that this is going around? If you are a film and video artist and you plonk your masterpiece on YouTube, and it gets, you know, a few hundred hits, and it's next to an animation of a kid's plasticine, animation that gets 3 million hits, that has a profound impact on people's understanding of where to put work and how it's valued. The project, very briefly to talk about, it's quite an old project, happened in 2006. Node London was a project to basically build cultural infrastructure in the city around art and technology projects that came about because the community of artists and curators that had been working in London, making artworks that were using technology to also critically comment on it, were frustrated that London didn't have the big investments in buildings or cultural infrastructure to support this work and to validate it, that the people behind the project were beginning to see in other European cities. Has anybody here been to Linz in Austria? Nobody? Museum of the Future, Ars Electronica Festival, an enormous kind of investment in the idea of art and technology as a cultural forwarding agenda for the city and for the nation. And, you know, the people in London, which of course has a very rich and very strong cultural history in many other respects, were kind of bewildered and frustrated that once again it felt like London wasn't taking the lead on something. London's a place that kind of styles itself about being very leading in so many aspects, but often lies to itself about stuff. We put on a month-long festival across the city, a season of art and technology events that were networked, so they were part of the same infrastructure, that were open, so a lot of events that were free. The structure was open, so all you needed to do to be part of the festival was to have an event which met a very broad description of art and technology stuff, submit your content to the central organising group, put it on in March, find yourself a venue and make sure you were resourced and you could be in the programme. And there were 90 volunteer organisers. So I was the only paid member of staff on the project. My boss was 90 people who ranged from artists, producers, and anybody else who wanted to walk in the room and input. There was no centralised curation. There were local curation in different venues. The volunteers, crucially, only worked on what they wanted to and didn't have to work on what they didn't want to. And through that, we understood what work was. Work was the stuff that you got paid because that offset the fact that you didn't really want to do it. And there was no voting, right? It was all consensus-based. So we're hearing a bit about consensus-based structures from Faith upstairs earlier to do with Festivals Edinburgh. There was no voting systems involved in it. And I met people during the lead-up to me doing this thing when I was the sole member of staff accountable and coordinating this whole thing. And I explained the terms on which I was doing it, and they looked at me with sort of deep concern and said, "Are you all right? And, you know, do you want me to try and find a way to get you out?" And actually I thrived on it because it was a very interesting early-stage attempt to kind of use a wiki-based organisational structure to allow people to make work on their own terms. 450 events happen in the month in 40 different venues, some of them very big, established cultural venues in London, some of them tiny, some of them not particularly arts and cultural venues, libraries. One of them was up a tree in a park. There was a tree climbing event. We essentially provided a central website-based resource. We provided a print catalogue. We put out a book. And to me, one of the indicators of success of the project, which is flawed in many respects, but was when an artist said to me, "Now you've put the map online and we can see where all of the different venues taking part are, I realise that there's a gallery just around the corner from where I'm based that I can go and start a conversation with and let them know I'm here." And there wasn't a means for people to do that. So just simply that act of getting organisations and venues into networked relationships, you know, convening these meetings where, you know, the art and technology programmer from the Science Museum would sit down with a few grassroots studios and go, "Isn't it weird how we never naturally meet? And isn't it great that we are? And so therefore, isn't it weird that this doesn't become customary to people to see that kind of, you know, get out of our boxes and work laterally?" That's quite a remarkable thing. Questions I have, particularly around audience and audience access and audience development. I've put in a very reassuring image here from a group called The People Speak, who do sort of creative interventions that are basically about amplifying the public voice. So this is called talkioke, like karaoke, but with talking rather than singing, and it allows people to talk about whatever they want to talk about, and it uses the sort of game show style technology to sort of get people quite excited about the idea about talking with each other. But I suppose this is a kind of cheap image because it is just by its look and feel, it implies that there was a greater and more diverse kind of community participation in the project than what I witnessed during the month itself. So challenge one really is just, I suppose, just about this thing about user-centred creativity and people doing it on their own terms and increasingly choosing and bypassing what the cultural infrastructure used to offer, which I think is quite an interesting thing to think about. Challenge two, user-centred design. There's lots more people in the shallow end of the pool than the deep end. So why, I ask myself too, when I come across an art and research project, is it often feel like it's being really strenuous in its thinking and it's kind of right down the deep end where some people are doing some incredible water acrobatics when there's so many people who could be reached by the work if it was in the shallow end. The Potluck was a project that I did in Chicago in 2012 with a company called Moti Roti that I was the director of at the time. Moti Roti's thing was very much about engaging communities and intercultural processes. We were invited by Columbia College in Chicago to come and have a residency. And the artistic director of the company, an artist called Ali Zaidi, works a lot with food and art and culture. So he increasingly puts food, serving food at theatre events, using food as a means to bring people together, establishing community garden projects which can then grow food that people can put on plates and so on. He's incredibly knowledgeable about food and its incredible history and so on. When we were invited by Chicago to come and do a project, we found ourselves talking about how the city has a history of kind of quite noticeable racial and ethnic segmentation according to geographic lines that spans back to public planning laws in the 1950s. So in crude terms, it's simply a case of kind of saying, OK, so we can see which block the Greek people live in, and we can see which block the Puerto Ricans live in. And and what's happened is an emerging generation in Chicago is coming up and is really awkward about this, of course, and really self-conscious about it, and it doesn't reflect the reality that they want to live. So the potluck was designed as a means to explore how we could use our creative resource base to develop the idea of an intercultural neighbourhood where we could mix identities, race, ethnicities, resources, viewpoints, harness latent resources, introduce people into new ways and use the arts and culture as a central means to do that. The reason why the challenge in relation to this is about user journeys is that, of course, the tech world has brought in a very strong and robust and, in some respects, quite challenging principle of user-centred design to the world, which is now adopted not just within tech but beyond it, in service design and other areas, and in some respect within the arts. But I don't see it happening enough within the world of community arts. So I go to some sort of gatherings where people talk about community art coalitions or research projects and so on, and the amount of time talking about the beneficiaries or the participants or the end users or howsoever described in those conversations seems to be worryingly limited to me. You know, it's almost like so much time is spent talking about the budget management, managing the politics, making sure the funder gets what they want, making sure the research question is robust, etc., 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 that I struggle most of the time to understand where that mechanism is that says, let's go and talk to some people who might be interested in what we have to offer and find out what they want to do, and to use that as a principle. The value of working with an artist who works with food is that, of course, everybody loves food, and it's a great way to get everybody around the table. Here's Ali running a workshop in Melbourne where we invited different people from different migrant backgrounds who are based in Melbourne to bring a dish to the table that reflected themselves and their cultural identity. And the value of that is not only does everybody get to have a really good meal, there was a lot of eating on these projects, but also people come to the table with content. People don't come at a disadvantage. People already come with strong identities and histories and a position and something to give as well as something to receive. And so that was a very, very powerful dynamic for us to apply. So we use food as a prism into these bigger conversations, which, of course, at a global level are increasingly pertinent and kind of universal. The age of mass migration and the fast-moving urban populations, increasingly younger, increasingly internationally connected, is something that's very, very on people's minds. And so working in that space feels like a great opportunity. So we ran food sharing events in Chicago. We basically formed our cadre of practitioners in the city and then went out and convened food sharing events in different spaces and invited people into those spaces. And we invited them to get there and to talk about the future of the city and to dialogue about it. And we did a tweet wall and we hashtagged the tablecloths and, people were doing stuff on social media and so on. But that was probably about as digital as it got. It didn't feel appropriate to not do anything. But it was very much about finding ways to start with the user, finding out where they're at, finding out what culture meant to them, finding out what was important to them that may or may not relate to the arts and cultural sphere. Here's a shot from the En Las Tablas Performing Arts Centre in Chicago, where the local community, so Spanish is going to be the third biggest, is going to be the dominant language in Chicago by 2030. So working with the Spanish-speaking community of Chicago, which had a problem to do, a perceived problem to do with a generation of teenagers kind of going into Chicago culture and losing their cultural roots, was something that lots of people wanted to talk about. So we went out and we worked with all these different groups and found ways and structures to begin to pull it together into a project. The way that we did that was to invite about 20 practitioners from Chicago, both from within Columbia College, who'd commissioned us, and at our insistence, people from outside of it, because we said if we're just working with people inside the institution, we're going to have an institutional mindset, so let's mix it up from day one, because that's important to the practice. And we brought together people's artistic impulses with ideas around, the practicalities of community engagement, but also around kind of service design and bigger conversations about where the value of what they do might impact in a different way. But I suppose principally it was about learning how to start with the community voice and to take that as a creative inspiration. Eating. Lots of eating. Now we've worked now with 35 artists, and the project continues under its own momentum. In the terms of our residency, we ended up doing something at the Smart Museum of Contemporary Art, where we showed something that was between documentation of our process and an interactive wall, very lo-fi, but to allow people to talk about what the city meant to them, talk about what food meant to them, and it was an astonishingly well-visited installation. It was part of it had that kind of mainstream art kick because it was part of a bigger exhibition with celebrity artists in it. So that was quite useful for us to do this. And in the process, what we've done is brought together a bit like Node London, a set of partners that continue to work together and to talk to each other and to support potluck-related activities. Interestingly here, this mix of venues is not just cultural institutions. The Inspiration Kitchen is a social enterprise that trains homeless people to work in the restaurant business. Dorchester Projects is founded by an artist but is essentially a slum take-back project. The Jane Addams Hull House Museum is in some respects a formal museum, but it also has a history of welcoming and looking after immigrants to the city over a couple of hundred years. And that seems to give kind of greater strength and durability to the network. Potluck Chicago continues as an autonomous group. It continues to meet, it continues to do projects and installations. So that idea of working so that you seed something which can exist after your own project funding runs out, to me, as an important design principle. Challenge number 3, sorry to be going too quick, the money side. We've just heard upstairs, or I had to leave early to come down here and begin sweating, but about the artist-led practice that gets into social spaces that are not often touched by the arts and cultural sector. And I think that's admirable. I also know that a lot of groups who work like that have a story about sustaining their work that isn't particularly told if they stay in the limitations of the formal arts and cultural sector economy. I think that the conversation about different forms of value and different economies is an important one, but it's not the only conversation we should be having. And I think it's a responsibility of senior cultural leaders to open up new economic avenues to resource work that I'd like to see, certainly in the UK, acted on a lot more strongly. Very quick example. So another motivated project, we made a mobile app called Multiwalks. It's available on the Apple Store and on Google Play. You can download it. It's okay. It's not without its faults. It's a bit too video heavy. But it was an experiment. It was an excursion into thinking about, again, this concept, which was the company's theme of intercultural migration, urbanization, as big, bold themes to be working in creatively, and thinking about that in the technology space, in the city space, what we could do. So Multiwalks is a free mobile app. We've made 5 artistic walks across 3 countries in Europe. There's 2 in the UK, there's 2 in Oslo, and there's 1 in Reggio Emilia in Italy. And we've also made a workflow to create more walks. So this is a live platform that can have other content added to at any point. It's a European Commission Award winner, which we were very pleased by, from the scheme called Diversity, which felt kind of cool and appropriate at the time. Each of the 5 walks in my own head as the producer was about saying, OK, so we can do this stuff. we can commission artists to work with communities using digitals in ways that feel good, but we also need to go further in 2013 when we were making it and ask about how can we scratch the surface of new economies and see what opportunities there are. So this is Ali's walk. It's made out of seeds and grains. It's in southern district of London, where we made a walk that goes along a street that introduces you to all of the independent businesses that work on this street. And we did that in collaboration with the local business improvement districts. Business improvement districts are new kind of bodies that have formed over the past few years that are there to drive the local visitor economy. So they take money out of commercial businesses who put it into a centralised pot and work out how to increase the visitability and economic fortunes of local specific areas. So given the nature of what we're doing, that seemed to me to be a very rich opportunity to start working on. This is a walk that we did in another part of South London called Vauxhall, which a lot of Londoners see as kind of grey and drab and just a place to kind of get through and get beyond. And we worked with a novelist there who was born there, who was really tapped into the local community and also was already offering guided walks himself. As you go through this walk on the app, these archive images break through the surface, and so it gets practically impossible to navigate, which is kind of the point, because there's so many layers of meaning in a place like Vauxhall that we wanted to explore. And with this walk, particularly in the context of what's become known as alternative tourism, people wanting something different from just being herded on and off a coach, stuck in front of, you know, the big what they call the honeypot tourist destinations, but want something a bit more bespoke, a bit more exciting, a bit more creative in terms of their tourism offer. The third walk of the five I want to show you, ended up being about street art. So street art, if you're in London and you go onto TripAdvisor, the third biggest walking tour offer, the third most popular, is street art tours in East London. It's an enormous thing. It's bonkers. I can't quite believe it when I was going to council meetings 15 years ago and trying to explain the difference between graffiti and tagging, and why one was a form of creative expression and another is defacement of a building. Now we're in this world where it's universally endorsed and, well, semi-universally endorsed. It's in a different space, right? So in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy, small city, has had a 20% increase in its migrant populations in the past 10 years, largely North African, Kosovan Albanian, Chinese. Our partners there are a group called Mondo Insieme, who worked with local young people from migrant backgrounds to create a series of street murals around the city that reflect the historical heritage and politics of the city. So full building works. They basically did 2 projects after they started working with. They did a kind of set of street art murals that were made by a kind of anonymous street art collective who I think I've met, but I'm not entirely sure. And the young people helped with those works, but also did video interviews with the people who live inside these buildings. And inside these buildings are elderly Italians made redundant largely in the 1970s when the textile factory closed, and a younger generation of immigrant families living side by side but not interacting very much. So we did this, and I was suddenly like, oh, so is there a model for street art, given how popular it is, that uses a digital platform that allows you to work out what's inside the building and watch you see the art? I'm not aware of one. Is anybody aware of one? So, you know, just this idea of kind of getting to the space and doing something bold and doing it from a community perspective and realizing there's something that you can make from it that you could leverage that might be of significant enterprise benefit. Bonus challenge. And it's kind of been implied by this, is I suppose just about getting beyond, when Niels and I were talking about me preparing for this presentation, is about getting beyond pond-to-pond funding in terms of kind of community arts practice. So one of the things that I think a lot of people in this room will be aware of is the tyranny of a financing structure, which means that you can at best plan 3 to 5 years ahead if you're lucky. The budgets are not particularly large, or they might seem large, but then if you work in a more commercial economy, you realise how small they are. Or if you work in the arts economy and then you get some academic research funding, you realise that all of these things are variable. But in general, they're not particularly big. And how this financing structure kind of acts as an inhibitor from ongoing, long-term, community dialogue. It gets in the way of all the stuff to do with long-term tracking of participant benefits. It seems to be that the kind of whims of the funding agencies in relation to kind of community benefit, and I'm talking about communities of all stripes here. I don't want you to have a mental picture of thinking about the poor, the marginalised, displaced. I'm talking, there's a community of people at this conference. The people who made the Node London Festival we're a community of art and technology practitioners. We're all part of multiple communities. So I'm certainly not talking from a fixation on those that are marginalised or apparently deprived in our society. Communities of all stripes. But within that, the way that the financing structures seem to work seem to be about short-term, stop-start, maybe, tokenistic, perhaps, and that one of the implications about this comes back to what I was talking about boxes at the beginning, which is to do with the peripheralisation of this stuff within arts institutions and how troubling that is. So how can we work smarter? How can we design projects from the get-go that could seed groups for the longer term and give them resource and means to sustainability? How can we do that, particularly if we feel that we don't know enough about enterprise economies or new forms of business models? Who do we need to talk to who isn't already in the mix? So there's the bonus challenge. And then, if we had more time, so what I've done is I've got some questions that I'd like to ask you guys, and then maybe you can ask them back to me. Maybe we can all discuss them with each other. I'm not sure how much time we have left. Hang on. About 15 minutes. So I've just got some questions here to kind of invite people to get on the front foot in terms of let's have a fast, useful conversation. The questions that I came up with: how can we make more inclusive and representative the ways that we bring together communities, artists, producers and technologists? So this happens, hack labs and whatnot. Cool, really cool stuff. I'm also aware, looking at it from a London perspective and looking at the international models that I've looked at, they're kind of not particularly diverse spaces. You can go to what's now called Tech City in East London, where, speaking frankly, the sort of gene pool of creative ideas around technology is much smaller than the enormous community that wants to associate itself with those ideas. And if the tech community is having, as it should have, a conversation about women in technology, where are the women? Why aren't there more women on panels? Why is it so colonised by white men? Then obviously we have work to do. So one of the conversations I had with Niels when I first met him a couple of years ago was about the scope for making spaces that actually take advantage of diversity in an expanded sense as an opportunity and as an asset. Question 2 for you is about, about noticing that historically what we seem to do is design community projects that give people their moment in the spotlight. Here's your drama training, here's your moment to work with a visual artist, here's your moment to collaborate on an urban design project and so on. And then the project stops. And it seems to me that very rarely do we have a kind of systemic approach to giving participants producer power as well as participant power. They're getting their hands on the levers of change and having some say into the future direction of an organisation. So if an arts organisation goes under, all of the participants, simply put, all of the participants with whom it's worked are kind of set back to zero, unless there's another one that they can work with. What changes in our institutions do we want? Because I think this is a question we need to be asking, and I think it's been implied by the conversations over the past day and a half. What changes in aims, in structure, in composition of its workforce? What changes in programme? What changes in attitudes towards partnership do we want to see? I think that feels, for most of us, like a very daunting question, but I think it's one that really needs action points hanging off it. This might be daunting to some people or not to others. The point about financing structures. How can we talk to funders in new ways? How can we talk to the money people? How can we think fresh about where the money comes from to support this stuff? How far will crowdfunding take us, given that crowdfunding and the DNA of what makes a successful crowdfunding project changes all the time? This, to me, seems like a question we should ask. what ideas and approaches might engage artists with the potential of social creativity in new and important ways. I'm very careful about when I raise this issue. So this is the first time that I've raised it in a kind of conversation that's being live streamed across the whole web. But I do think that there's a conversation that we should be having with artists about how the space is changing, because artists are having difficulties. And there's also, I think, a massive culture shift in terms of where the centre of gravity is in around communities that may or may not be squared with artistic training, artistic aspiration, and so on. So I think there's some beady questions that could be asked in that space as well. Last question, you'll be pleased to hear. It's been a bit of an avalanche. It's been a bit of an avalanche afternoon, actually, hasn't it? Sorry to add a few rocks to it. How can we routinely build digital ladders of participation into projects and programmes? I think this is a really important question. It's partly about making sure that there's an online, offline, or online/in real world offer within projects as standard, and how we do it routinely, how we're not like, oh yeah, we did that project last spring that had a digital element, but how it just becomes as much a part of the DNA of creative programmes offers as making space available or making a museum collection available and so on. And the thing about that, I could rant about the digital divide and we could talk about that. I think most people probably know enough about that and what it is. Perhaps the most interesting question for this conference is saying, given that there is a digital divide and there will continue to be digital divides of different kinds, how can we design our projects and programmes and organisations to ensure that there are kind of gateways that allow people in to develop skills in relation to how we work? That's it. So, questions, comments, feedback, lively discussion. Ida is probably going to stop us talking in about 10 minutes. I need to repeat the questions when you ask them as well, so that it can be...
Well, I'll pass this around so that the online audience will hear. Comments, questions? Raise your hands. Go back to the...
Oh, here we go.
Just introduce yourselves, please.
Okay. Is it on? Okay. My name is Erling Björgvinsson and I live in Malmö. And we have around 30% migrants in the city, so it's a quite multicultural city. And some of your projects were addressing those issues. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking in relationship, it cuts across, I guess, some of the questions that you raise around funding. Because my experience from Malmö is that we can easily get funding if the projects are kind of safe and bringing people together. But if they raise too critical issues, we don't get funding. And right now, the question of migration is, for example, I mean, it's pretty tough in southern Sweden. We have something called REVA, where different institutions are working together to increase the number of paperless people being deported. So those kind of questions are impossible to address or work with. So I'm just thinking, is that something that you have experienced?
Just to say, this image at the end here is of a project that I did in about 2000, where my team worked with people seeking asylum in the UK who'd been in the country for about 3 weeks, and at most, and were in the process of being dispersed within the UK to take the pressure off London and the South East. So it was a time when the media were very antagonistic. I mean, it's happening again in a slightly different way, but at that point, British newspapers were the hideous ones. We're talking about a tidal wave of refugees washing up on the shores of the UK. So we gave people cameras just simple, what do you call them? One-use cameras, disposable cameras, and said, show us what home looks like to you. And this was a big learning project for me. I mean, in terms of being able to get in the space and make it happen, but I think also more profoundly. This was the first big project that I was really, really proud to have produced, to have conceived and produced. And when I started it, I had this very art world take on doing this stuff. I talked about a cascading program that would move from photography through to film, through to live theatre and so on, and very ambitious and all very much in the head of a white middle-class heterosexual guy from England, right? We went into the emergency accommodation and where they were based, and it was an environment where obviously there were a lot of people under extreme psychological stress, and some of the characteristics of that environment were that lawyers would come in and apparent lawyers would come in and encourage people to sign a document in the lobby of the hotel, and so people would do it, and at that point they would sign away their legal rights to representation to any other body in the UK, and the person who got them to sign it would get £50 from an office back round the corner. And so we never got beyond photography. It was really chaotic. Most of the structure fell apart. There were something like 73 different languages that we worked with, or did our best to work with. We learned to communicate a lot through expression and body language. And I was chatting to a guy, an Iranian Kurdish guy, during it. And he said, oh, it's great having you guys here. It's brilliant. And I started a conversation with him about the intrinsic benefits of the work, about, the empowerment, the this, the that, whatever. He said, well, just to kind of cut you short, I'd just like to say what's really great about it is that you've allowed us to bring the children in here, the young children, which is the primary benefit, because if we weren't in this room, they'd be playing in the nursery, and the nursery has excrement on the floor. And I think for me, that was a moment of actually really fundamentally rethinking about the assumptions that I make about the value of arts and community work, because I think it's a very introspective, self-justifying community that has learnt, often because it feels persecuted in relation to the rest of the cultural sector, to talk a language of we empower people, we build confidence, we transform society, we provide opportunities, da-da-da. But when you bounce that off people in the real world, often people are like, that's a nice fun thing to do for an afternoon. Because, of course, the people that you work with, their definition of culture is much bigger. It's football results, it's weather patterns, it's train timetables, it's language, it's the lawyer in the lobby. Just to get back to your question about the finances, I guess the point about the interesting thing, so Malmö is going to be the first plural city in Scandinavia quite soon. It's happening amongst the under 25s. More than 50% of the population under 25 is non-indigenous, I think. Somebody from Malmö might correct me or give a more accurate thing, but that's about to happen. And one of the things that I've noticed on the Moti Roti projects is the amount of migrant-led businesses that are very entrepreneurial, very interested in kind of cultural activity. And, I've stood up in rooms in the UK and for a certain audience, you give a list of migrant-led businesses that can convince people. So you start talking about Google, Goldman Sachs, Marks and Spencer's, Yahoo, and so on. And you suddenly realise that the migrant enterprise impulse is extraordinarily strong. And the cultural impulse is very strong as well. So to support this work, it seems to me that the trick that we're missing at a financing level is about reaching out to that network, which we don't know about. We don't really know a way in. And the fact that we don't seems to be because we're too undiverse and our networks are too weak to reach into places like that. And so we need to do something about that.
I was just thinking about, I don't know if you get public funding, but my view of it is that usually public funding, they expect certain type of outcomes, and one outcome they don't want is criticality. So that agency is often taken away from a lot of the people that are engaged. So you're supposed to be show the positive sides of the multicultural society.
Yeah.
But directly, if they turn and criticize power, then it becomes a lot more tricky.
Well,
I'm just interested to
personally,
hear.
I try to get less and less sort of public funding as time goes on, because I don't think it keeps me sharp. I think it's harder to do useful work in what's a kind of a very ancient sort of funding structure. I think that the thing about criticality is, personally, just in terms of the stuff that I like to produce or support or to share with other people, I'm a big believer in fun and accessibility and scale, actually. I think that there's a lot of work, and it's partly because perhaps there isn't so much of it, that when there is an opportunity to do the work, you look at it, it's just a few people, and it's a bit like, this is the painful story of the unheard voice. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't pain there, and that's certainly a legitimate voice, but it's also not, it's a harder work to get people to engage with that content by virtue of the aesthetic by which it's been put together. And, you know, is there therapy in there? How's the therapy working? Whose benefit is it for? And so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think one of the powerful things about working with Moti Roti is that they started out as a carnival company. And it's interesting to work with artists. So the two co-founding directors of the company were not from European backgrounds, particularly. One of the directors is of Trinidadian Asian descent, and one is from India via Pakistan. And they used to do big celebratory carnivals, big stage spectacles, and so on. But within that, they would design in the community voice in ways that were really inspirational for me when I was just getting going, when I was doing that photo project, realizing that here were some high-achieving artists that could do work that would get major funding, major stakeholder backing, and have the voices of communities deeply embedded within it, was the inspiration I needed. And what I think is important in that is to note that that ability to do that started from outside the European mindset. So I think if there's a lesson in that, it's partly about how we should be working more routinely with people who are not like us. If they exist.
Hi, I'm Ruth Orr from the British Council.
Hello, Ruth.
Hi. I'm interested in issues of sustainability and how you can keep these initiatives going. For instance, with the initiative that you mentioned with the deportees,
Yep.
how do you give it a life beyond this one initiative to make real social change happen?
Yeah. So there's a great book called "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded" by an activist black women's collective based in Manhattan that sort of analyses the kind of the failures of the conventional arts landscape to support radical, so positive social change. And it's a very interesting book to read. It's very angry. It's very sharp in its analysis. It's not always right, but it also, at the end of the book, begins to give some examples of alternative structures, as in legal and organisational structures, that are emerging in the US that could be used to better further the work. In the UK, because that's the only thing I can speak about in detail about this, I now increasingly look to social enterprise structures as a means to achieve it. And I think that's smart on a variety of levels. I think that there's more creatively minded people gravitating towards that focus anyway and finding out new ways to do stuff with it. I think if you are working in a way that says to you, you need a central trading purpose, you need to be viable without having to kind of lean on anything else that might then have its own temperament, about criticality, or about timescale or whatever. If you can control your own destiny through establishing a trading purpose as the first and foremost aspect of what you do, then potentially you can use that as a means to generate profits that go back into the social good. So I think that's an interesting model. I think it's still kind of working itself out. I couldn't really talk about the Nordic states and whether these kind of... Does a social enterprise structure mean anything if you're in a Nordic state? It's kind of basically, it's a business form that is not a charity form, but you establish a trading company that has an asset lock, and with your... So any profits that you generate have to be reinvested into the socially good purpose of the company. So it could be anything from furniture recycling for schools through to a community kitchen, through those kind of things. You know, the example of the Inspiration Kitchen in Chicago was one. That's a style of social enterprise. All profits that it makes to a restaurant go back into training to get people off the streets. So I think there's an answer in there. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask one last question, just about changing things like urban regeneration forums, places where you can start to actually get the potential partners in these equations to shift their thinking as well. Are there ways of doing that? Again, I mean, I asked a question about policy before, but how you can change the way that those involved in urban regeneration, you've talked about the BID partnership, but at a policy level where new funds can be released from government at policy level that will commit to culture. It's not happening at the level that it might at the moment. You have to struggle with your individual pitch and your individual idea. Are there ways of scaling that up?
Well, I'm embarked on this journey at the moment because I actually did quite a lot of commercial work with culture and urban development at the moment, which is remarkable actually because the urban development sector again wants the arts and cultural ticket to support its own work more and more in terms of placemaking. So I do a lot of placemaking work now, and it pays well. And I noticed that the agencies through which I do it don't compete with the arts and cultural sector at all. I think in terms of the community, supporting communities through those processes, I've got as far in the journey of understanding that the community consultation process that is the dominant model for major public build projects in the UK is not about community consultation. It's about managing objections. So by the time a community consultation process happens, the designs are already so well developed that if you reach a point where the community says, we don't want this here at all, or we object to the shape of the buildings or the type of wood that you're using, and that turns into a Facebook petition where 60,000 people object, then a property development company or an architect's firm might have got 2 million quid down the Swanee. They might have just lost a lot of money. I think it's further upstream. I think it's with master planning. I think there's some artistic work in this space, future cities and, what do we do to connect arts and urbanism and community development. But if they're in the traditional economy, they feel increasingly to me like kind of cosmetic work that reflect the inventiveness of the people who do it, but aren't going to lead to systemic change. So I think the big opportunity is upstream with master planners. So one of the walks that we did in Oslo for the Multi-Walks project was in Bjørvika in Oslo, which is apparently quite a heavy migrant-dense district. And it was a question about the terms on which Oslo is regenerated, because apparently Bjørvika is next to a major cultural quarter which has had heavy investment. So it was a kind of artist asking questions about how these resource allocations are made and whether and what the alignment between resource and demographic is within the city. And it was a good project. I think it's a moving experience to have. Please download the app and do it. Tell all your friends, etc. But I think it's kind of only gets so far. It becomes a critical artist analysis of an urban environment. And actually, it's about how do we get to the top table with some of this stuff. And the difficult reality is that in the general context here, I think what's been reflected in this conference for the past day and a half, and what I find is reflected in most of my work, is that within this, the economic paradigm that we have, community voice it's not sufficiently important to work on it in a transformational way. So on that cheery note, Thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed the session.